Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor, and today I am joined by Ganesh Cherian. Ganesh, thanks for being on the show again.
Very excited to be with you, Megan. It's always a treat, and I am excited to be able to spend the afternoon with you, or at least a little while.
Yeah, this is great. So I said again because I interviewed you along with Gene Judson for Latter Daily Digest just about a month ago, I believe so. And for some reason, I forgot to publish that video on my channel. So I will be publishing that video on my channel later. But just to introduce you to the people out here, Ganesh has just published a book that is a topical biography of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism.
It's just been a month, and it's been really exciting to be able to talk about Joseph in quite a different way. Many of you may know, but Joseph Smith was born in Vermont in 1805 and went to New York and there published the Book of Mormon in 1830. So, and this began the Church of Jesus Christ, which then morphed into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which made most of its home in Utah and is a big presence in the United States, and certainly has some impact across the world. And I'm from New Zealand, so it even reached my little part of the bottom of the world and became important in many people's lives down there, including my parents, who joined the church when I was small, and I grew up in the church. So being a young man, looking at the world and, identifying with a young Joseph who was asking questions, Mormonism really appealed to me. I went to a church high school, and then I served a mission. I met a fellow missionary there, and we ended up getting married and raising a family in New Zealand. She was American, so that meant that we went back and forth to the States quite a bit, including living in Wyoming for a year and a half. And during the time that we were really fully committed to the church, I also served as a bishop in Wellington. And it's been a wonderful part of my life, but it's also meant that there's a number of things that I've had to deconstruct as I've learned more about American history, Mormonism's place in that history, and also the idea that some of the things that Mormonism does and is responsible for might need some investigation, might need some accountability. And so part of writing the book was looking at what happened, why it happened, when it happened, and what are the implications of some of those things. So that's what the book really tackles, and it does it by chapter with regard to a particular topic. So it takes things like American exceptionalism and takes them from early American history, how that was played out in Joseph Smith's family, how it worked in his personal life, how it was talked about in the Book of Mormon, what then that meant for the early church that formed on the publication of the Book of Mormon, and then as Joseph and his followers moved from places like New York through to Ohio and Missouri and then to Illinois, how that affected their connection to the United States, but also the people around them. And then Joseph was killed in 1844 in Nauvoo, Illinois, or nearby. And, that has, subsequent to that, Brigham Young took a large portion of those followers and moved to Utah, and that's the biggest branch of the Mormonism movement. And so those kinds of topics, American exceptionalism, things like even patriarchy, I talk over, white supremacy and how that affects the church and has affected the church, Native Americans and their place in a church, and certainly a scripture like the Book of Mormon, which talks about them. Also, things like theology, things that people were thinking about with regard to God in the early 19th century and how they played out through the Book of Mormon and into the early church and became the distinct doctrines that Mormonism is known for today. I also talk about some of the prejudices that Joseph had in his life and how, because he was poor, because he was disenfranchised, how that played out in his life, how it played out in the Book of Mormon, and how it changed because he became important and popular. And then I also talk about Joseph Smith's magic worldview, because he came from a very esoteric understanding of this unseen world that was going on behind the scenes, and he had particular connections to that with regard to magic. And that played into the early church too. It was a Christian magic, but it was certainly a magic, and it was a magic not everybody appreciated. So once the church began, that kind of got suppressed quite a bit, but still turns up even today in various interesting ways. So those are the kinds of things that the book kind of covers. Hopefully it gives a good, by looking at things and being able to track them through with these topics, it gives people a good idea of what's going on and why and how it plays out in American history, but also into the present day.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you come to this, having grown up in New Zealand for the most part, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and growing up in the church, being raised with all of that, but knowing that it was really an American church. And I'm curious about how that played into how you felt about the church as you were growing up, and when did you become aware that it was mostly an American religion and that it was about American exceptionalism and all of that?
So a few interesting things happened to me. Firstly, I always knew America was special. And generally I knew that because in my congregation, my ward in Wellington, lots of our membership were from the States. They had come. Okay. Wellington has a big movie scene, Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson, that was filmed in Wellington. And so we had a number of movie people come to Wellington, and these were really proficient American people, with incredibly high skills. That's why they were coming across the world to do these things. But we also had academics, professors who taught at the local university. We had because Wellington's the capital city, it's also usually the place where the US embassy is. So we had a lot of American people who were either served in the military or served in consular positions that came. And then we also had a number of, professional people, corporates who had, who brought over people. So we always had very exceptional American people in our ward. And those people, because they were so good, they often got really prominent callings for the time that they were in the area. And that meant that I had an inflated understanding of America, that people were incredible in America because all of the Americans I knew were incredible. In New Zealand, when I grew up, of course, American TV and movies dominated. In New Zealand, growing up, I had two channels. One was a British channel, because New Zealand has a really close connection to Britain. It's a Commonwealth country. We recognise, was the Queen, and now we have a king. So British sovereignty is a big part of our lives. But then, of course, the second channel was American TV. So I grew up with the same kinds of shows that you will have grown up with. Fantasy Island, Benson.
I was going to say, name some of your favorites. I know you mentioned Benson in your Mormon Stories interview, which I actually watched on the plane on the way back from Sunstone Conference that we were both just at. But Benson, that was one of the ones that I watched as well. What else? What were some of your other favorites?
Three's Company, I quite like that. Oh, of course, different strokes. There was like I married an American, and it was surprising how much we had in common. Of course, because we watched the same TV shows at the same time, so it didn't feel like a cultural difference, even though we grew up in different countries.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to watch Three's Company, because that was very scandalous to have a man and two women living together in an apartment. My parents did not want me to have that as an example. And then we watched a lot of Family Ties. Yep. I wasn't allowed to watch The Facts of Life because the title implied that they might be talking about sex. And so, of course, that was a no-no.
Right.
There was one other that I really wanted to watch, but I was never allowed to. We watched a lot of Happy Days and stuff like that. So yeah, you and I watched a lot of the same shows.
The Fonz and I, we were like that,
Yeah, well, you have similar hair, so it makes sense.
What about Little House on the Prairie? I watched a lot of Little House on the Prairie, which was
we watched that.
Really interesting when I got to Wyoming. It's not quite prairie country, but it's certainly high desert. And American culture dominated entertainment across the world and really permeated the idea of things like a functional nuclear family. Generally in New Zealand, lots of people are brown like me, lots of Māori and Pacific Island people, but not a lot of black people. So I got my understanding of maybe even black culture from, the Cosbys, which might be slightly worrying now, but, there's just there were some things that were heightened that I gave more credit to than would you, and also some things which probably weren't really representative of the United States, which I didn't know because those are the programs that I was consuming, right? So just fascinating kind of insights, and I've had going back and forth to the States and living in the States, I realized some of those things, they might hold true in parts of the United States, but they're certainly not the norm. And also too, this is terrible to say, but all of the people I knew were really proficient people. And then when I came to the States, and certainly when I was living here, I realized, there was a big range of abilities and intellect and, capacity and all of those kinds of things. So, which, I just wasn't aware of because, all of my experience with America was very high, and, recognizing that that's not the same for everybody. I should have realized, but you just don't know what you don't know until you discover it's different.
Yeah. We don't know about it. It's just like almost anything else in our lives, until we get exposed to a variety of experiences, we think that our experience is, the only one. And especially as younger people, we're somewhat self-centered. And so it's not until we have a little bit of a broader worldview that we realize, oh yeah, there are people out there going through different things than what I went through.
Yeah. And I married an American, and of course, when you're talking about American exceptionalism and the church being America, I realized that the church was the promised land, right? Utah was the place. It's kind of Mecca. After I finished my mission, I went on a tour of, a couple of years later, I went on a tour of North America, and one of the most important parts of that was to go through Utah and go to the temple in Salt Lake and see a lot of my companions. I'd had a number of United States companions and meet up with them. I also ended up meeting up with the missionary who was my friend, Lindy, who ended up becoming my wife. So that was really nice. And one of the odd things about that was that when I got married, I was 23. Lindy's a little bit older than me. She was 26. But my status went up in the church, because in the church, to be married is just better than being single. So my status went up. But my status went up even more because Lindy was American. And so I kind of doubly increased just by getting married. I moved up kind of 2 steps because Americans were valued in my place in my congregation. And so, so just a few months after I was married, I was elevated from, in Mormon terms, from elder to high priest. So I was on the high council, and I was very young, way too young for most things. But just because I got married, and I'd married an American, suddenly I got more status and more responsibility. And of course, that eventually led on to being quite a young bishop in my early 30s. So, yeah, and Lindy was very proficient. She's an incredibly gifted person. She was made the Relief Society president of our ward, which was also a big scandal at the time because there were some incredibly proficient women in our area, and the fact that an young American woman usurped them all was a navigation that Lindy did incredibly well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So did people feel like they were being passed over?
Yes, they did. And
Okay.
So there was some resentment there till she won them over. And I'd grown up in that area, so I already had some prominence, but yeah, it certainly took a little bit of time. So those are the things I look back on some of those things, but also I look at those things, and I'm really interested in people. My degree's in psychology, or one of my degrees in psychology. And so I'm really interested in why people do the things that they do, and also how it affects them, what their belief systems are, what they actually act on, all of those kinds of I'm a people watcher as well as a people investigator. I ask interesting questions, hopefully, and get some interesting answers. And so I'm always trying to figure out. And so part of the book was kind of looking at whether I could figure out Joseph. I mean, he's a historical figure 200 years ago. From the documentation and the fact that the church has made available the papers, the documents that related to Joseph as part of a Joseph Smith's Papers project, meant that I could investigate parts of his life, a great deal of it at least, online in my lounge in Wellington, New Zealand, rather than having to look up archives in places like Salt Lake City or Nauvoo or parts of New York. So and then I could maybe see some patterns that existed in his life that were formative for the church and that continue to impact members of the church even today.
Yeah. So what was it that originally sparked the idea to do the manuscript or the book? I know that you talked about trying to figure Joseph out, but what got you to the point where you wanted to do a biography on him?
It kind of didn't start out that way. I had a faith deconstruction when I was in the United States and realized lots of the things that Mormonism were doing were Americanisms and not necessarily Christisms. And that sparked my interest into early American history, especially as it related to Mormonism. And so that was an interest going on for quite a while, particularly from 2012 right through to 2021. And as I learned more, one of the two things that happened, one is that Sunstone, which is kind of a conference of Mormon history and culture. It was COVID, of course, and they were publishing their seminars and talks online. And one of the ones that I listened to was from William Davis, who wrote a book called Visions in the Seer Stone. It was about the idea that the Book of Mormon was performative, that Joseph was performing the Book of Mormon. He wasn't necessarily translating it. He was imagining what was going on in early America, and he was speaking it into existence, just like you might do a comedy routine or a play. And there were a number of features of the Book of Mormon text that give you an understanding that that's what's really happening. And I just found that an incredible way to look at the Book of Mormon. And I've noticed some oddities, and it made me want to write on it. I've written on a few articles which had got some traction, and I learn from speaking, from writing. When I've have to craft ideas, that's how I learn. So it's just me putting things down on paper. Dan McClellan who is incredibly big in biblical studies, and a member of the church. He didn't often talk about the church, but when he did, he talked about the Book of Mormon as this 19th century text. And so I was, and again, I'd seen some things that made me think, oh, this is much more about America than it has to do with some ancient civilization in the Americas. So when I started to make those connections, and I thought I would write a little article about some of the things that I saw, particularly the difference between what the Book of Mormon said, which was published when Joseph was 24 years old, and what the church adopted as its unique practices by Nauvoo in 1844. I started to see some differences between these two very important data points and explain them basically on the basis of Joseph's maturity as a young man, poor, trying to make his way in the world when the Book of Mormon was created. But then he was was quite a different person by 1844 when the Nauvoo was a part of things. So it was a big deal that he changed because his maturity changed and the kinds of things that were important to him developed, because the people he was exposed to, and as he moved from state to state, the differences in the people that he was encountering changed the way that he looked at the world. And so therefore his theology changed, his practice changed, the way that he led as a church leader changed. And so you could account for the church in 1844 by the things that had happened to him as a young man engaging in leadership positions.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. I've heard Dan McClellan say that before. By the way, Susie Catherine, thanks so much for the super sticker. I've heard Dan McClellan say that the Book of Mormon makes the most sense if you look at it as a 19th century text. And it actually started to make a lot more sense to me when I read Fawn Brody's biography of Joseph Smith, No Man Knows My History. Then I started to really see the context in which the Book of Mormon was written. And what you're saying makes a lot of sense too, that Joseph's ideas and needs and leadership all would have developed and changed over the course of time as he got older, as he experienced different things. So I'm really glad that you organized your biography of him by topic so that we can see how those ideas changed and evolved over time. That's a lot how my brain works. So I really appreciate that you did that.
Well, it's how my brain works too, because one of the things that I found really tough was that when I started to deconstruct and recognize that there were some problems with Mormonism and its history and its practice, it just became overwhelming very quickly, because you'd learn something and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. And then you learn something else and, oh, I don't know that either. And then suddenly it would just cascade. And for me, that just became really overwhelming very quickly. So one of the things I hoped with this is that people would be able to avoid that by at least scaling it down to a topic, and then they could see all the things with that topic, and then they could understand, how it all happened. And so hopefully it's a bit of a resource book for people to go, okay, I'm interested in this subject. What happened? And give me the skitty. I don't want to, I want to know exactly. You don't have to sugarcoat it for me, but I just want to know, because it just doesn't make any sense and I have no idea. And so the trajectory of Joseph's life is represented with all of these different topics, and you can go through and go, oh, that makes sense, or I see when he changed, and it's just hopefully. And so far, that's been the feedback. So I'm very grateful that what I hoped is actually coming to pass. But yeah, and it's good for me. Hopefully, it's really useful to other people.
Yeah, I think it definitely will be, especially people who don't have a good handle on the entire story of Mormonism. I really think that being able to have access to all of these different topical ideas will give people a lot of information about the church and its its evolution over Joseph's life and all of that. So I'm really grateful you did that. And I wanted to have you on today specifically to talk about violence in Mormonism, because it's a topic that I've been thinking about and writing about for a long time now, trying to make sense of my own family's case. And so while I don't want to talk about that case at all today, I will just mention to people who may be new to the channel that I'm the cousin of Lori Vallow Daybell, who was Mormon. We were both raised Mormon in the same Mormon family system. And I am going to be writing some more about that case, but I want to do it in the context of understanding that Mormonism has kind of a violent history, and it started with Joseph, as you were educating me while we were at Sunstone. And so I thought that would be important for us to cover this topic for people today. So what can you tell us about Joseph's most early violence?
So probably the earliest violence that Joseph was involved in, that we can tell at least, was that when he was 6 or 7 years old, his family got typhoid, and his older sister almost died. He got a bone infection in his shoulder that actually moved down to his leg, and he had. Through a very traumatic surgery, he managed to, the doctors from nearby Dartmouth College managed to save his leg, but it had some ongoing ramifications for him in terms of pain and discomfort, and also just walking. Joseph walked with a limp the whole of his life. He used a cane, almost all of his life, and of course that he ended up being quite a tall man, 6'2", I think 6'3", and really quite physical. But he suffered under a bit of pain the whole of his life. He had to prove himself a lot. The typhoid, the family had come from a wealthy farming family and had money, but Joseph's father had lost it as part of ginseng speculation, and so the family was plunged into poverty, and they were just getting back on their feet again when this typhoid fever hit, and the doctors and all of the care that was part of that meant that the family was plunged back into poverty. And Joseph was lame. He was lame for several years. So he was small. He wouldn't have contributed much to the family finances, but all hands were needed on deck almost to keep this family afloat. And he didn't. He couldn't contribute, or at least his contribution was storytelling, because he was not in a position where he could help out physically. Another thing that's really important to note is that during his convalescing in 1812 was the 1812 War. So this was known as the Second Revolutionary War. Basically, when the US declared independence from Britain, this was the Declaration of Independence, of course. I'm telling everybody what they already know, and this created the Revolutionary War. The way that Britain and the rest of Europe were operating, there was a lot of conflict, right? Britain was also fighting France, and Spain was in the mix there too. So when basically the US won against Britain because their forces were slightly divided. But by 1812, Britain had defeated France, and Napoleon had been exiled, and now Britain was like, okay, round two, we can really put our might towards the US, and they went, they went for it. The borderline between Canada and the US, they did incursions into the US. They rallied Native Americans who weren't having a great experience with colonial settling across the United States. They rallied them to fight against the settlers. This was a huge deal. A lot of these battles happened on the sea across the eastern seaboard, and even British troops managed to incur right through to Washington, D.C., sack the White House, burn it to the ground, and occupy D.C. for, I think, 26 hours. This is the terrorist attack of its day. This was Joseph Smith's 9/11, and it was, people were worried. Joseph was living in New England, near the Canadian border. These things were happening in his backyard. This is, and he was fascinated by it. His grandparents had, both grandfathers had fought in the Revolutionary War. His maternal grandfather, Solomon Mack, had also served in the previous Indian-French War. So these were dominating, the headlines of local papers. This was just his world. So violence, he'd had his own traumatic injury, but he also was listening to these, to what was being talked about around him. He was reading the papers of the time. People were talking about this. It's just big, and this was his formative space of convalescing that was being invaded by these kind of ideas. So it's really, really significant. The US ended up, the War of 1812 ended up as a stalemate, basically. No borders were changed. Effectively, the United States and Britain agreed to disagree, and no change happened. So it's kind of a bit of the forgotten war, because, well, firstly, the US don't want to admit that that Washington DC was ever sacked, right? And because they didn't kind of make any progress, and Britain made any progress, nobody wanted to talk about this at all.
Right.
But so there were no winners, particularly, but there were some losers, and the big losers were American Indians, because they had really mostly fought on the side of the British. And when Britain kind of just went back home, those American Indians who were in the borders of the United States, they were seen as treasonous and demoted. This led eventually to the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Yeah.
So, and then there were the other losers were the people who in the United States who were supportive of Britain and Britain's involvement in the New World, and this Federalist Party, they had a huge collapse. And so after this particular 1812 war, people were, so huge nationalism, to be the United States was a big deal, American exceptionalism, because we beat the best powers in the world, there's all of this era of great feelings for this new America that had guts and had permanence because it had been challenged and won. So these were parts of his life. Then,
so I guess I'm what I want to relate this back to is just because this was going on in Joseph's backyard, and it was everything that everyone was talking about. I'm guessing that he probably was exposed to some newspaper articles and his family discussion of the war. I'm curious to know, did you read some of the articles from the old papers? Were there any available? Could you tell how graphic the descriptions of it were? Would he have been exposed to graphic descriptions or depictions of battles that were going on?
Yes, is the big answer to the question, and also there became a basically a textbook for Americans. It was a kind of very American nationalist kind of book that described the 1812 war, called the Late War, that became available to school children to really describe some of these events. I don't know that I mean, they're not horrific, but it certainly was traumatic. And we see a lot of that mirrored in the Book of Mormon, the kinds of the fighting that happened, and the imagery that portrays in there. So yes, definitely. One of the other big things that happened, particularly to New England folk, who a volcano went off in Indonesia and it spread ash around the world, which meant that during 1814, 1815, basically New England had no summer. And Joseph and his family, who were already poor, they were really struggling to survive. And this precipitated a move from New England through to Western New York, where the conditions were much better. But part of that trip, Joseph was really harassed by the teamsters. Remember, he's lame; he doesn't walk very well, but he was forced to walk a great deal. He was whipped by the teamsters for being, slow. It was brutal. It was violent. And he, I think that also contributed to that early violence that he had as a young man. And then we see from accounts of his neighbors that he was a scrappy guy, he had to fight for everything. And while conditions for the Smith family improved in Western New York, they were always on kind of the bottom run of the ladder, which meant that often did menial tasks, day laboring, and of course, as the family needed money, that's how the older boys particularly gave to the family. And so it was hard work, it was menial work, it was brutal. There are some affidavits from the people in Palmyra suggested that often Joseph got into trouble, got into fights, drank a little bit. It was a bit scrappy for him. And so he was, young man on the frontier trying to make things work. It was hard. It often meant physical labor, physical force, and also physical violence. So these are just parts of his life. I should say, though, this is not everybody's life in early America. There were people who came to the United States, particularly as religious refugees, who were kind of the opposite. They were trying to be in peaceful communion with a lot of the other people that were around. Now, the Puritans, they were pretty violent. But people like the Quakers, they came with the idea of being, peaceful. We still see that today with regard to the Amish, the idea that they would be, separated from the rest of the community, because they had a deep sense of caring and non-violence. In fact, Amish today still you can what they call it, they're excluded, not excluded, released.
They're isolated, or
no, released from military service. They don't have to participate in the wars. So if you think about the story of the people of Ammon in the Book of Mormon, the idea that they don't have to fight because they've laid down their weapons of war, that's really a great parallel to the way that the Quakers were viewed in early 19th century, that they had taken on, because of their religious oaths, a form of peace, and they were not required to fight. They were sustained by others, and they in turn gave support, usually just supplies to the military,
Right.
those kinds of things.
Yeah,
So,
we'll have to do an entirely separate episode on violence in the Book of Mormon, because we could go down that rabbit hole for probably a few hours, because there's a lot of it. The Book of Mormon is actually a very violent book, and people don't necessarily think about that because it's a book of scripture. There's plenty of violence in the Bible as well, but I just think, putting the framework on the Book of Mormon, that if we do think of it as I think you do, that Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon rather than translated it from plates, then his lens really would have been what we see that scripture through. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to explore violence with Joseph himself, because maybe it explains then why there was so much violence in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. And I make that case a number of times with a number of things. And so I think there's a number of things that played out with Joseph that was interesting. One is that he had to fight for everything because he was poor. He was on the bottom run. And that started to make a really... there's a few other big parts of violence that happened to him when the church was first started, and he's trying to make it something grand. He got arrested again in Bainbridge, South Bainbridge, and Colesville, and he was roughed up, taken to court. People didn't like him, and it was quite a shock to his makeup. In fact, there's a number of Doctrine and Covenants sections in that June, July, August of 1830, which really, when you read it and understand that the backdrop was him in a violent situation, being afraid for his life, you can see it in the text that he's really worried about what this future will be. He's trying to console Emma, who's also worried about his physical safety, and these are coming up in the not only it has come up in the Book of Mormon, now it's coming up in the Doctrine and Covenants revelations. So it's just fascinating to see. And then the ways that he pivots for his own safety, meets Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon tells him about Ohio, goes to Ohio. That becomes a place of safety until 1832, when he suffers at the hands of a mob for tarring and feathering. And that then, really worries him with regard to his safety. And so he's always slightly fleeing. And there's a bit of refugee narrative, which also plays through the Book of Mormon, because he's fleeing violence. But then there's also the flip side of that, which is in that at some point the refugee gets sick of fleeing and ends up fighting back. And that's what happens when in 1834, when we see him organize basically a military campaign to go to Missouri to fight the Missourians who have kicked out the members that are there. And so this starts a really interesting transition from a refugee church to a militarization and an army and military church, which now starts to become bigger and bigger. It gets worse by 1838, when Joseph and Sidney and Hiram and those who support them flee from Kirtland and go to far west Missouri, and there effectively form a little paramilitary army which fights against the state, and then they get kicked out of there. He reconfigures in 1840 in a little place called Nauvoo in Illinois, and there, as part of their city charter, they put some big things in place in terms of military and a militia, which ends up being the Nauvoo Legion, which is effectively a huge army that Joseph then becomes in control of, and and throws his weight around with. So those are really interesting developments in his life. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. I also want to make sure that we mention the reasons why there was violence perpetrated against Joseph Smith, because we do know in the Doctrine and Covenants, he details a lot of these situations where he's acted against violently. Of course, the tarring and the feathering. As a child, I remember hearing that story and thinking how horrible it was that someone would, that would do that to our prophet. And I know that there is sort of there can be with some Mormon people a little bit of a victim complex or persecution complex because of the history of violence that was perpetrated against Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram. Of course, they were both killed. And so I just want to touch on some of the reasons why, number one, he was arrested. And then I want to also go to those couple of instances where he was, tarred and feathered or beaten, and talk about why.
Yeah, so basically in Missouri, where Joseph was arrested, and also in Illinois when he was arrested, he was brought up on treason charges because he effectively tried to undermine the United States and the United States Constitution. Of course, the Book of Mormon is very pro the United States Constitution, and the early Doctrine and Covenants Revelation sections are also very pro the Constitution and the rule of law and the ability for a civilization to have rules in place. But Joseph, as he keeps making, I would say, poor decisions, and people are really affected by them in terrible ways, he finds that he ends up fleeing and taking matters into his own hands to fight back. These things are against the law. He's imprisoned for treason on the basis that he has basically created civil war. This almost happened in 1834 in his march to Missouri, but it certainly happened in 1838 fighting against the state government in Missouri, and that's why he was, brought up on treason charges. He actually escaped and fled to Illinois, and of course at that time in American history, states are like their own sovereign countries, and so pursuing somebody past the state boundary had some problems. And so Joseph avoided extradition from Illinois for the next few years in some quite creative ways. But then he basically fought against the state, got to almost civil war in Illinois, and Governor Ford, arrested him and brought him up on treason charges. So Joseph is treasoner, and that's something we never talk about. He got so treasonous he was going to leave the United States. We talked right at the very beginning about American exceptionalism, but by the time that Joseph is in Nauvoo, he thinks America has failed religious minorities like the Mormons, and he's going to flee. They're going to leave the United States. Joseph gets killed before this happens, but
right.
Brigham Young takes that and runs with that and flees to Mexico territory, which gets annexed by the United States along the way. So he ends up still in the United States when he gets to Utah. But they were fleeing the United States. They were trying to operate outside the United States. They were forming a theocracy against the United States. And this was incredibly treasonous as an act.
Right.
Even when they got to Utah, and now it's a part of the United States, and they're having to deal with the federal government, even though they've got such a distance that the federal government for a long time doesn't have enough resources to kind of give any oversight to them.
Right.
They're thinking about whether they should move to Mexico, move to Canada, or move to what was then Russia in Alaska. One of the craziest stories is that their plan flee to Russia meant that Russians who thought that Alaska would be difficult to protect against Mormons sold that to the United States so that they wouldn't have to deal with people like Brigham Young. And so the United States got a really good deal on Alaska and made it part of the Union.
Yeah. And then the Mormon church ended up sending people to Canada and to Mexico to avoid prosecution for polygamy, but that's a rabbit hole for another time. But I do want to go back to talking about, so thank you for covering that, by the way, what Joseph was arrested for. Now let's go back and talk about some of the mob attacks and what that was about.
So we don't know about, we know that the earliest kind of attacks against Joseph were around the fact that people felt, particularly in New York, that he was swindling them through this process of basically looking at a stone in a hat and declaring that God was telling him things and making people around him give him resources. And this continued through into Ohio when they moved there. So there were a couple of things that were probably going on. One was that Joseph and Sydney were changing the theology, and that felt very dangerous to people. So they wanted to send a clear message that this was not wanted. The other was that Joseph was commanding a gathering, and when people gathered, they had to give their resources to the church as part of a communal understanding that all the resources should be held by the church. And of course, Joseph was very poor, so he wasn't giving anything of any value, but he was getting a lot of value. There are two understandings of why the tar and feathering happened in 1832 to Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith. One was that they were on the Johnson John farm, and Joseph was being taken care of by John Johnson, and his sons believed that part of that communal united order that Joseph was implementing, that he would take over the farm, and there wouldn't be any inheritance for the children. So that was a big issue. But one of the factors in that particular tar and feathering was that they brought a doctor to perform a castration, which suggested that part of the complaint against Joseph was that he might have some impropriety to some young women, and perhaps a young woman called Miranda Johnson, who he ended up much later becoming, taking her as a plural wife. So there are instances in Joseph's life where he was accused of impropriety, and that suggests that one of the reasons for such violence against him in 1832 was connected to that. So we don't have enough of the historical record to make a really good understanding or a good prediction of that. But certainly what happened later and how it played out with other people suggests that Joseph had impropriety was a part of his character and makeup, going back, and also significantly into Ohio, where he had a lot more control.
Right. So the first record historically that we really have of Joseph with a young woman is Fanny Alger. Is that correct?
Well, not exactly. Actually, the earliest kind of impropriety that we know of is one of Emma's cousins who gives testimony that he heard Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery talk about adultery as if it was okay, and that Martin Harris had participated in some adultery and that Joseph had been okay with that, but also that Martin Harris had been okay with Joseph's interest in Emma's friend Elizabeth Winters. So that is actually, while that affidavit was in 1834, that was related to a time back in 1828. So that's our earliest understanding that there might be some impropriety. I guess, of course, it's hearsay. It's hard
Right.
to kind of quantify, and of course, the historical record at that point is not great. There's also during the Bainbridge trials of 1830, Josiah Stoll's daughters were brought up for testimony. We don't know what they said, but it seems weird that they would be brought up for testimony. So that could be related also. We have this castration part of this attack in 1832. So that, again, that gives us some idea that there might be some impropriety going on. And then, yes, we see in 1836, thereabouts, we're not entirely sure of the dates, that Fanny Alger, who was a housekeeper, kind of a pseudo daughter in the Smith home, because of course they've got Emma's got small children. Joseph is entertaining people a lot. They needed a lot of help, so Fanny Alger was in their home as a help. There's some indication that Emma regarded her as a daughter, that she's young, she's around about 16 years old. And there's definitely some impropriety there, because we know that Oliver Cowdery had to settle some arguments, and he was very upset with the way that Joseph had handled himself with this pseudo-daughter housekeeper in their home, Fanny Alger, and it caused a huge rift between the bosom buddies that were Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, and it ended up basically splitting their relationship by 1838. Joseph and the church excommunicated Oliver Cowdery, and for a number of reasons, but one of them was that he insisted that this was an affair, and Joseph insisted it wasn't. So this became a bit of scandal in Kirtland that affected a number of people.
Right. Of course. Okay, so now I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about the instances where Joseph may have been the one who perpetrated violence on someone else. And in our talk, the other day, we were talking about different types of violence. There's social violence, there's spiritual violence, and then there's physical violence. I want to talk, I guess, first about the physical violence part of it, and I think we'll probably come around to the other two as we go.
Right. So I told you earlier, some of his neighbors' accounts talk a little bit about the violence that existed in Palmyra. And there certainly was some in Ohio. A couple of really interesting things that came up through there. If you go and read the Doctrine and Covenants sections, you see some interesting coercions. One of the first ones, and probably that underpin that tarring and feathering in 1832, is this idea of communal living, people gathering their resources together. And part of this united order or united firm was that people put into it their property, their cash, and then the bishop would then divvy out what they needed. And so this was a kind of a communal way of living. But the problem with that was the revelation said that they could put the stuff in and they would live as a community. But if somebody decided they didn't want to live in this community anymore, they left without any of their Jasmine's saying, if Joseph is marrying his adopted daughters, what is that called? Celestial incest. And basically that is what it is.
Oh, yeah.
So
anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, that's
I just saw that go by.
That's great comment, and Jasmine just has some incredible thoughts in this area, so I always love her perspective. But the idea that you could contribute, but then if you were ostracized or kicked out, or if you chose to leave, you left with nothing, and that's a form of violence, right? It's it's a resource violence, but this is slightly the frontier. What you had was your life. So that's a really big deal. But even through Ohio, Joseph was involved in a number of skirmishes, one particularly with his brother, his younger brother, William, and he often didn't see eye to eye. Joseph seemed to love him and support him a great deal, but there's an incredible instance where they have a very physical, very public fight, and Joseph is really beaten quite badly by his brother William, even though William is younger than he is, and this is huge. But Joseph is, this is a big physical fight. That's not, William got the better of Joseph, but Joseph was certainly in amongst that. Another huge.
Do we know what that fight was about?
Well, actually, yes, we know. We have the record. Basically, it was about entertainment. William. So there, what are the entertainment options of the day? Well, part of them is, going to each other's house, and one of them is having debating societies, right? And, debate is quite important, and people, arguing back and forth. And William had set up a kind of a debating challenge at his house. People would come, maybe we don't know exactly what the details were, but it was jovial and fun. But some of these arguments were quite heated, and Joseph was doing other things and would go along to listen to these, at the end of the day, and they were quite heated. Joseph was worried that this was causing a bit of, conflict with people, and he basically told his brother, you need to stop this. This is not the will of the Lord that we should, engage in debate, and this is causing conflict. And that just escalated to the point where William saying, you can't tell me what to do. And
typical brothers.
Typical brothers.
What's really funny is that I knew about the debating society. I knew that Joseph didn't like it, but I had no idea that it came to physical blows over it.
Yeah.
Just shows my lack of study and research on Joseph's life.
Yeah, William was even probably more hot-headed than Joseph was. And in this particular scenario, it really got bad. It got so bad that William by this point is in the apostleship, and people want to drop him from the apostleship because they just don't trust him. And Joseph has a huge loyalty to his family and to his parents. And during discussions, he hopes that being an apostle will reform William, and so he advocates for him to stay even after this event. So it's really, there's some really interesting dynamics of family loyalty that's a part of this. Another really bad kind of confrontation that happens is between Joseph and his brother-in-law, Calvin Stoddard, and this comes to blows. This actually goes to court. It gets dismissed because Calvin backs down, but Calvin almost lost his sight from this. It's a really bad beating he gets from Joseph Smith. And we know from even from Joseph's friends like Luke Johnson much later that Joseph did not suffer correction very well. Joseph always wanted to be number one, and he would throw you out of a meeting, physically throw you out of a meeting. He would boot you out, with his boots. This was an incredible. He had incredible physicality. We talk about the stick games that he would post, but those were in many ways more power dynamics than they were play. This was a way for Joseph to show his physical prowess, that if he was challenged, he could mete out some physicality in some heavy ways.
Yeah. So so for those who may not know, the stick game, I think the one you're talking about in particular is pulling up sticks, where they would put a long stick on the ground, and both people would grab the stick and then see who could stand up first.
Yeah, or throw the other person, because you could, if you pulled hard enough, that would put the person over top of you, right? Rather,
Yeah.
So you could actually show them that you could hurt. You were stronger than they were. And Joseph had, I mean, Joseph had a limp, right? So he had a disadvantage if he was standing up, but if he was on the ground, he was quite physical. He could show his prowess that way. So while we might talk about these things as nice little family games that showed a bit of fun, actually they were power dynamics, and they showed that he could have the better of you if he wanted to.
Yeah. So I just want to say I'm starring all of these questions that are coming up, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. I don't know, Ganesh, do you have a time restraint that we need to live within? I didn't even ask.
We can keep going for a while if you want to.
Okay.
So the other, a couple of other physicality things that are really important. One is that the Doctrine and Covenants talks about those who dissent, that they will be given over to the buffetings of Satan. So, and I think that's a really great word. It's probably a euphemism for violence, and we see this after that after the tarring and feathering of Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith in 1832. Sidney and Joseph go to Missouri just like a few weeks later. When they get back from Missouri, Sidney Rigdon is out of sorts. Now, he suffered a head injury when he was younger, and some people believe that this is part of his manic depressive episodes that kind of marked his life. And when they got back from Missouri in 1831, Sidney basically said, "It's over. The priesthood has been taken away. The church is defunct, and go home, everybody." This was in town in Kirtland, and Hiram heard this. He's like, "Oh, what's happening here?" He rushed and got Joseph. Joseph came back and assured the people that had heard him that no, the priesthood's still evident, and Sidney Rigdon's just having one of these episodes, and he's going to be turned over to the buffetings of Satan. And sure enough, Sidney had a manic episode for the next couple of days where he was turned over to the buffetings of Satan. Now, we don't have any record of what, but it's a bit of a thrashing. We don't know what kind of happened, but it sounds like a beating. It sounds like a Sidney, pull your head in, get in line, because this could actually be, you've got to pull up. And Sidney got in line and supported Joseph ever since. And when they get kicked out of Ohio in 1838, Sidney starts to become much more verbal about violence, and that's the precipitation for the Missouri Mormon War. So, violence.
So it was Missouri in 1838 that they got kicked out of, right? Okay, yeah.
So the church becomes, the ways that Joseph is working with the saints and dealing with dissonance becomes more and more violent. We see this in 1837 with the Grandison Mule. Basically Joseph says, if he gets put out of the way, that would be something that God would approve of. And he also uses, and this would be interesting for you, he also uses the same kinds of wording that, it's better that one man should suffer than a nation dwindle and fall for unbelief, which is, taken out of the early part of the Book of Mormon, where Laban is the justification for murdering Laban is that he is, he's a barrier to, the church or the gospel going forward, and that's a justifiable action on God's part to take out people. And so,
right.
Yeah. Joseph
That
just
justifiable homicide is what we've talked a lot about on this channel. Obviously, it featuring prominently in Lori's last trial. And so while you're talking about the very first few pages of the Book of Mormon, the story of Nephi and Laban, this justifiable killing of Laban, based on the fact that Laban was in the way of Nephi and his family having the scriptures. And so they perceived it as a spiritual attack on them. And so they justified it with a physical attack on Laban. And now you're drawing this other parallel where Joseph felt the same type of violence may have been necessary.
Yes. And Grandson Newell, complained to the courts about this, and Joseph went up on trial about this, and even his own followers said yes, that's kind of what he was talking about, but because it actually didn't end up in Grandison Newell's physical assault, it was slightly sidelined or at least dismissed. So interesting that it was just that hair's breadth of Joseph not being taken up by that. And of course, when they got kicked out of Missouri, of Ohio, and went to or fled for their lives, really, they didn't get kicked out. They doubled down on the violence aspect in Missouri. The Danites were formed to protect the presidency of the first presidency. They enacted these kind of oaths of death oaths to for the Danites to make sure that their loyalty was kept. And so you see these kind of echoes of Masonry and come into the play. Joseph hasn't become a Mason by this point. He doesn't do that till 1842, but the same kinds of mechanisms for control and loyalty, we see with the Danite oaths that they make to the first presidency. So this is, the violence is ramping up as Joseph's life is going ahead, and it's a terrible theme.
Yeah,
it's a theme that ends in his death, of course, but it's a theme that just gets taken by Brigham Young to a new extreme,
to another level. Yeah. So I want to make sure that we're very clear about the Danites, because a lot of people watching will not have ever heard of the Danites, right, or know what they are. So just to put a very fine point on it, it's Joseph Smith that institutes this group that he calls the Danites, and they sort of swear an oath to Joseph Smith to protect him physically. And they do it by carrying out acts of violence against other people. Am I correct in all of that, or did I get some of it wrong?
Yeah, so we don't know if Joseph actually implemented or whether it was their idea and then he just ran with it. But it was certainly exactly what you said. So they so a couple of things that happened. One is that the early church at least had some forms of democracy or egalitarianism, the idea that people shouldn't be above other people, and even as hierarchy started to creep into the church with regard to office, one of the Doctrine and Covenants sections suggested that different groups were equal to each other, so that they could provide checks and balances, so that if one group, and even if one person, like the president of the church, was not following the gospel, these other quorums would be able to keep him in check and be able to, basically override the church. So this is kind of what happened by the end of 1837. People were not happy with Joseph and the Kirtland Bank dissolving, that they felt like he was out of line. And he had caused them to lose their life savings. So this was massive. And they were going after him. He fled with Sidney Rigdon, and part of that fleeing, he got a new revelation that basically said that the first presidency was on top of everybody, and they couldn't be held accountable. And so in Missouri, because of these threats against the leaders of the church, they the idea of a paramilitary group that was aligned as kind of a secret army, or secret police even, to bodyguards almost, they would make sure that the leaders of the church, particularly the First Presidency, were protected, and anybody who was a dissenter was aligned for violence. Sidney Rigdon did a what's called the salt sermon, the idea that, if the salt is lost its savor, it's no good for anything and it just needs to be destroyed. And that was cue to the people in Far West, particularly the Whitmers and Oliver Cowdery, that if they stayed there, their lives would be in danger. So they actually fled as they were excommunicated. And then the Danites were initiated through these death oaths that they were to provide protection to the First Presidency, and that they would be the kind of like the top military leaders, because Joseph is forming a little bit of an army to protect the members of the church. Sidney Rigdon did a July 4th oration where he basically said, Missouri is the promised land. We are here. Missouri, if you don't fall in line, Missouri citizens, to support us, it'll be an act of extermination, and we won't hesitate to, you can imagine that went down really well. This was printed and distributed around the area. This was effectively the beginning of the Missouri Mormon War. At least it was the war of words that, the people in Missouri were on notice that that the Mormons would act violently if they worked in that way. And this paramilitary group, this kind of elite forces, you could say, they were heading some of the, as the Missouri people, did not adhere to that and felt like the Mormons were a threat, this became escalating violence run by the Danites that effectively turned the Mormon Missouri War into a violent episode.
Yeah, and according to Joseph Smith, Missouri was the promised land. Jackson County, Missouri. That's where Jesus is supposed to come again. And so, to the Mormon people, they really believed that they were being ousted from their Mecca, from their Holy Land. And that's one of the reasons why they sort of, I guess, one of the reasons why they felt like violence might be justified, is because they believed that they deserved to be there, that it was, God had given them this promised land, and that they just, that they were God's people.
Oh, and look, you can read the Doctrine and Covenants sections in the timeline, right? So you can, because they have the dates on them, you can see that originally, Joseph, when the Missouri people, certainly back in 1833, when they were ousted from Independence, Missouri, that the Revelation said that, don't worry, God will fight your battles for you. You just stay calm, stay passive, and God will deliver. But by 1836, this had not happened, and so the Revelation started to get increasingly dark and violent, and suggesting that the saints needed to take things into their own hands to preserve this holy land. And so, it went from God defending them and, restoring them to their inheritance, which had been promised them by Jesus, to, God saying, well, vengeance is coming, and actually now it's not just me that's going to avenge you for your loss. You're going to have to avenge yourselves. And so, the revelations get more and more violent, because God doesn't deliver them. He doesn't turn up. And so they're going, well, where are you? And Joseph is getting these revelations, or, determining that actually they're going to need to fight. And so this is becoming more and more a problem. And of course, for people like Thomas B. Marsh in Missouri in 1838, he's seeing the Danites, this formation of this paramilitary group with allegiance to Joseph Smith, regardless of what he does, as the same kinds of Gadianton robbers that are told about in the Book of Mormon. So the idea that this is terrible, and he and Orson Hyde go to the Missouri government and swear affidavits that Joseph is actually acting against the state, and this is the basis for the treason. He's undermining state law for his own ends against the Missouri people. This is what's happening. It's horrific.
So
it's horrific.
it is really, really horrific, and it's a part of Mormon history that even a lot of faithful Mormons don't know. I only know just the smallest amount about it, because from teaching gospel doctrine, and then once I left the church, I did some real research, but certainly not as much as you have. And this is definitely something that, a lot of people just don't know these details. I'm curious if anybody yet has done sort of a side-by-side of the Doctrine and Covenants, where you synopsize maybe a section of the Doctrine and Covenants and say, but here's what was really going on behind the scenes and the reason for this revelation.
Well, actually, I've been doing that. So I've got I got a TikTok channel, and I've been going through the Doctrine and Covenants and going, okay, here's what's going on, here's the text, and you can see what's happening behind the scenes. And so I've collated them into groups of 10, and then I put them onto YouTube as a kind of thing. So you can go and see them, and I've been doing them. I'm actually up to 121. I got distracted with the publishing of the book and things, and I need to finish that off because it's the last bit of it. But
so maybe that can be your next book, and then you can send me half, since I gave you the idea. I'm just kidding.
well, a lot of these things I talk about in the book, because the Doctrine and Covenants, because you can see in the timeline how it's getting more and more violent, how it's getting more and more frustrating, because Joseph is getting revelations that people believe are coming from Jesus Christ, telling them that this is the promised land, right? This is their inheritance. So they feel incredibly entitled to it. So they're going to these places with the idea of basically saying to their neighbors, look, we've got a revelation from God that tells us that this is our land, and you are either secondary, or if you fight against us, actually you're going to be destroyed. You can imagine how that goes down. And of course, these people decide to kick out the Mormons from independence before the Mormons, get to the point where they're strong enough to kick them out. And this it just goes on and on and on. But I do detail that in the book. You can see, one of the chapters I have is on refugees. So you can see that Joseph has a refugee narrative for a long time in his history, right through to basically 1831. But then, as the refugee narrative is, flee. It comes up again and again in the Book of Mormon, right? Flee to a better place, and God will take care of you. That's basically the refugee narrative. But in practice, the refugee narrative does not work. Flee to Ohio and God will take care of you. No, the Ohio people are upset with you. Flee to Missouri and God will take care of you. No, that's not what happens. The Missouri people are now upset with you. So basically Joseph pushes back, and it becomes violent, and he organizes people. And of course, this is part of the persecution narrative. They're pushing back because we're righteous, and we're the best people ever, and these are the evil others, right? So that's the persecution narrative that comes out of the refugee narrative to explain why God doesn't seem to turn up with all of the resources that they need to be in peace. And then, of course, when these things are told later by the church, because of course the other narrative is the people there going, these people are coming in, these crazy zealots are coming in and telling us that we are the evil other and that God's going to destroy us and this is their promised land. That's not the rhetoric that the church tells, right? The church tells the narrative that Joseph is being persecuted against. It doesn't tell you that Joseph is going into these places telling these people that now he's in charge.
Right.
It's
So there are two big things that I want to make sure that we cover before we run out of time. And one is the angel with the flaming sword, and the other is the Nauvoo Expositor.
okay. So the angel with the flaming sword is the story in Nauvoo, and one of the things that you've got to realize, and I think it's really important to do so, and hopefully it's come across in the book well, and that is, these things are happening to people in real time, but it's happening to them, and they don't necessarily know what's happening to other people in the same space. So, as a historian looking back, you're collating different, bits and pieces and trying to figure out what's actually going on. But those people, sometimes they know what's happening to this other person over here, but sometimes they just don't know. They don't know that Joseph has told the same story to one person, and he's now also telling that same story to another person, right? And one of the great stories that is told in Nauvoo multiple times by Joseph to women for whom he's proposing a relationship is that the Lord has commanded him, and also that an angel with a drawn sword is ready to cut him down if he doesn't carry through with this. So the idea that his well-being, violence that might be enacted on him by God through an angel, is their responsibility, and they need to act in accordance with what he's telling them. And he's telling them that they need to be in relationship with him, and this is how this is coercion. Absolutely.
It's very predatory behavior.
It's terrible, and and we don't know that if these women know that he's using the same technique with other women, but we certainly know that there's a couple of them who have described this technique of making them feel like that in order to avoid violence, they have to act in a particular way with Joseph. So they
have to give up their lives to be a polygamous wife to Joseph.
An incredible, problematic and horrific, thought. Especially since he's well beloved, and now he's putting his fate in their hands. Yeah, I'm sure that there were probably some people who just said, "Oh well, good luck."
And
funnily enough, he never gets killed by an angel with a drawn sword. It never happens to him. So
well, I think almost all the women except maybe one, right, that we know of. I guess I should say documented. We have one documented case of someone refusing him.
Oh no, there are a few.
Okay.
But again, most of the people who, the only one that's public with that is Sarah Pratt, particularly. And actually, we have Sarah Pratt suggesting a refusal publicly. Nancy Rigdon suggesting refusal publicly, and then we have a number of others that seem like it's not public, but it's people know about it in Nauvoo, and then there's some private ones that we know of later from various reasons. So there are quite a few. The ones that were quiet about their refusal, they didn't incur any wrath, but those who were public, they got slammed in the Times and Seasons publicly in the paper. So they suffered a huge backlash, which again is incredibly violent, shaming them, suggesting that they are women of ill repute, so it's just it's
that reputation destruction, that what I call it social violence.
Yes.
And especially for that time to have those accusations printed in the public paper, it would have been the equivalent today of, somebody going on social media and doing a smear campaign across all the different platforms. And, it just, incredibly violent against the women that refused. So just another thing to add to at least my personal inventory of things that I consider Joseph to be very predatory in many cases. So
hard, and that's not a narrative that we've told about Joseph's character,
right.
but it's certainly a part of this historical record. So that's huge. And I guess that leads us to the Nauvoo Expositor. So things that are really extreme by the mid 1840s, and particularly June of 1844. And his counselor, William Law, who knows about all this stuff, is just getting reports, right? Maybe he's the only safe person that people can go to. And so he along with his brother Wilson and a couple of others, get a printing press, and they start talking about some of these things. And the first Nauvoo Expositor issue comes out on the 7th of June 1844, and it causes a huge stir. They're in the midst of printing a second publication, and Joseph and the city council decide that this is a public nuisance, that this is terrible. They vote on it, and of course they send the police to enact violence on the printing press, destroy it in the street. This causes basically a riot in Nauvoo, where people are like, destroying a printing press. This is one of the foundational ideas of an American society and the Constitution, the freedom of the press, and upsets everybody. Joseph declares martial law, involves the Nauvoo Legion to enact this, and of course nearby towns are up in arms. They form militias. Governor Ford gets involved to try and keep some peace, because this is the beginning of civil war in Illinois on the backs of the destruction of the paper. Wilson Law and William Law, they complain to the courts. This escalates exponentially in the days after the Nauvoo Expositor. But the Nauvoo Expositor is incredibly interesting as a document, because it documents a number of things that Joseph is doing that is wrong, and one of them is polygamy, and that's a really big one that obviously is a huge emotive thing, but it's not the only one. One of the things that I do in the book, effectively each chapter is like a short story on a particular topic, right? And Joseph dies at the end. Spoiler alert. But he died. I try and show that he dies for a different reason, or at least there is something underpinning that particular topic that is related to his death. And the Nauvoo Expositor is a great source of that. So things like things that are really problematic, like the separation of church and state, which are foundational to American history. That's a part of what the Nauvoo Expositor is complaining against. Polygamy is obviously one that they're complaining against. The ways that Joseph is taking care of the finances and the property distribution in Nauvoo is one of the complaints. The Constitution, problems are complaints. Theocracy is a problem. The fact that he's crowned king, this is treasonous, right?
Right.
That's a problem that the Nauvoo Expositor to talk about. So the one great thing about the Nauvoo Expositor is it provides a contemporary evidence of all of these things. And of course they promise that they're going to reveal more. That's just the first issue, and so they're working on the second issue when it gets destroyed. It would be so interesting to have that as well. We only have that one issue,
Right,
because they're just printing it at the point where it's destroyed, but they're detailing a number of complaints against Joseph and how Nauvoo's become a theocracy, how there's thievery and underhanded law things that are going on, and this is just horrific. But it's and obviously Joseph is perpetuating this violence against the printing press, and and Wilson, particularly Wilson and William Law, who, that's an implied violence against them. So that just ends in a blaze of glory by June 27th, 1844, where Joseph and Hiram are now in Carthage jail on treason charges, and mob storms. A vigilante mob made up of actually really prominent citizens from the area. It's not like it's some nobody.
Farmers with pitchforks, or
like it's literally the most prominent people who just feel like Joseph has evaded accountability under the law already lots of times, and they just don't believe he's going to be held accountable, and they just want to get rid of him. So it's fascinating, and hopefully I present it well in the book, how fascinating it is, but also that these are pillars of society who are really objecting to what's going on in with regard to Joseph and Hiram, and leads to their deaths, their murder.
Right, exactly. So so many things to unpack there that I know a lot of people are not really aware of the full history. So you're just going to have to buy the book, guys, because there's too much for us to talk about on one podcast. Even just, trying to just take the sliver of violence in Joseph's Mormonism, an hour and a half here, and we've just barely, touched the iceberg of it. There's just so much to dig into. And I know that it's much more comprehensive in the book than even what we've talked about today. So go buy the book, everybody. I put the link in the description, as well as in the chat here. And now I just want to see if we can answer a few of these questions.
All right. Yes.
Okay. Gali Sinatra wants to know, I would love Ganesh's book, but does he plan to make an audiobook with him voicing it?
It's 606 pages. It's going to be, days worth of audio, but I hope to do something, or at least get something out. There are some mechanisms with AI that perhaps they can voice it if I can give them a sample that will allow them to. So it could potentially sound like me, but not actually be me. And that way you could have it, sometime this year rather than sometime this century.
No, I was going to say there are people want you to voice it because, as I've said and Jean has said, we could listen to you talk all day long. We love your accent. So
I worry that people that my accent might be distracting, or at least they might not be able to understand some of the words. I speak American because I grew up with all that American TV or when I was a kid. But the amount of times that people say, "What? Tell me what? What?"
So maybe hire a voice actor with a slight New Zealand accent that's a little less heavy than yours, and maybe that'll be a good middle of the road.
I hope that people are able to the great thing about publishing this on places like YouTube is that you can turn on subtitles, and it generally gets it pretty good, so that anybody who is struggling with my accent might be able to still get what I had in there. And even the print version, New Zealand English is fashioned after English. So I had to, but I published the book in American English. So I had to go through and spell check it based on American English. So there are no rogue U's in the middle of of words that Americans are not akin to. But that was a violence to my my literary sense. Like I'm a New Zealander and I want to say this in Kiwi speak, and yet I have to use American English because most of my audience is American.
Yeah, definitely. So a couple more questions here. Jasmine Height Bradley had so many good ones. How much did polygamy factor into Joseph's death? I think we touched on it a little bit, but the Nauvoo Expositor, of course, listed polygamy was one of the things that, the bad things Joseph was doing. And I want people to understand, the general public to understand, that at this point in history, Joseph had not made polygamy a revelation or had not made it public And so he was practicing polygamy secretly and then openly telling people that he wasn't practicing polygamy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think there were so many other things going on at the time. And hopefully I could do a good job of showing that while polygamy, yes, is a factor, his secret polygamy is leaking out to the others. His secret crowning of being a king is also leaking out. That's also secret. But some of the other things that he's doing are incredibly public, like evading the law through habeas corpus ways. So in my book, effectively there's 45 chapters in 5 sections, and only one of them is about polygamy. So I think, yes, it's definitely a factor. If you go to the Church History Library and you can look it up online, there's actually a horn that was part of the vigilante mob. They what you can see that it's inscribed with Joseph Smith the polygamist on it, so that was definitely one of the factors. But people were incensed about Joseph for a number of different reasons, and and in my book it's only one of 45 reasons. So I'd be interested to see if once people have looked through the book and read it, and polygamy is the most, probably the most controversial of all the subjects, right? And it's the one that we probably are so emotively connected to. So it feels grand, it feels big, and it is big. But I wonder if if you're able to take a step back objectively and look at all the other things, then you might go, oh gosh, I mean, treason is a really big deal. I mean, when was the last time you heard of anybody, being held up for treason? It just doesn't happen very often. Right. So it's such a small part of our consciousness. But actually,
especially back then, when they were so close to the revolution, and there were so people were so patriotic and dedicated to the country. It was, I think. Well, I'm just speculating, but I'm guessing it was much more rare back then than it even is now.
Yeah, and really close to people's hearts, right? I'd be interested to see. Well, I'd be really interested to see how Jasmine feels about that once she's gone through. I know she has it. She said I saw her and she said she has it on her nightstand, so she's reading through it at the moment.
Nice, very nice. So this one is from Deborah Owens. Would the book possibly be available in a public library? Are you planning to market to libraries and get it in there as a reference book, hopefully?
Yes is the answer to the question. I don't know how to do that. So if anybody can email me about what to do on that regard. I mean, one of the reasons I published it via Amazon was because I'm a first-time author, and I just didn't have any great weight in the literary world at this point. But also I was having some problems with the church with regard to legal stuff early on, and so I wanted to publish it from New Zealand under the ISBN that comes from the National Library in New Zealand, and so some of those things which would have been sorted out by a publicist or a publisher in the States, I just don't know how to do. So any advice on that vein, I'd love it.
Yeah, excellent. So another question here from Jasmine. Did Joseph beat Emma or harm her in any physical way?
So there is an account where in Nauvoo, particularly by William Clayton, who says that after Emma basically found a plural wife, or at least identified that somebody might have been one of Joseph's plural wives, that this ensued a huge argument in which Joseph had to basically restrain Emma. So William Clayton doesn't go into details whether this is a beating or whether this is just physically holding her down, or whether this is a verbal kind of a chastisement. So we don't know exactly, but there's certainly several times. I mean, the two sections that are in the Doctrine and Covenants that are addressed to Emma, one is section 25, and the other is section 132. And section 25, if you read it with the idea that Joseph is maybe pressing on Emma that her responsibility is to support Joseph, there's a little bit of coercion even in section 25. But there's certainly even bigger coercion in section 132, where she is going to be destroyed if she doesn't follow through with helping Joseph. So that verbal violence would suggest, and it's quite descriptive, destruction. And if you think about the idea that actually Joseph has a number of people who are afraid that he is going to enact physical violence on them in Nauvoo, people like William Law, who complains to the High Council that Joseph's secret police may well be looking at taking his life on Joseph's orders. The idea that Emma might be destroyed is not just a euphemism from a gospel perspective or a spiritual perspective, that it might actually be a physical perspective. So yes, it's entirely possible. We just don't have enough historical information to say that that's exactly what happened. Emma was a pretty formidable person in her own right, and she did enact some things against Joseph in retaliation. So, whether that's just because she didn't fear, a physical reprisal, or whether she was by that point, so incensed that she was okay if that happened, or it's really hard to tell.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So just two last little things here. Well, I want to show a couple of comments. Mel Stiller says, when man wants something for himself, he always claims that God has ordered it. That is a decent view, given the couple of things that we've talked about today and historically on this channel. It takes a real narcissist to be a polygamist, in my opinion. Just call me Kim says. And then I do want to just
there's
briefly,
a lot of entitlement there.
Yes.
And we see that, and we see that even in his early life, Joseph feels quite entitled, and he just gets more emboldened as he gets more power.
Yeah, definitely. And then I want to just touch on this, blood atonement is our heritage. In your opinion, did blood atonement, the idea of blood atonement, for those who don't know, is this idea in Mormonism that there are some sins that are so grievous that you deserve to have your life taken and your blood spilled on the actual ground in order to atone for those sins. So did this idea start with Joseph Smith? Where did it start? Where did it gain traction? If you have any info to lend on that.
Yeah, so that I believe it does. I mean, we talked about the Danites and the Danites' oath. It was a death oath. That if they revealed those secrets, or if they were disloyal, that they would have their head cut off, right? And that we see that again with the when Joseph, adopts Masonry, really, or becomes a part of Masonry in 1842, and then the endowment ritual that comes as part of that. There's death oaths as part of that, and part of participating in polygamy, and participating in the temple meant having a death oath that your throat would be slit, or your bowels, you would be disemboweled. Those things he utilized as a loyalty and coercion and conformity mechanism, and those things kept in the church through to the to 1990. So that's only a recent thing. And we also know from the Council of 15 Minutes that the death oaths were a part of that as well. So there are a number of places where we see that loyalty was attached to acts of violence, spilling blood. And I think that that Brigham Young in Utah just codified that, maybe took it to that next level. So that's one of my gripes, is that I think all of the things that we see that Brigham did in Utah were just continuations from what Joseph laid down as a foundation. And Brigham Young was in a position where he was the territorial governor, of course, and he's in a theocracy, and he's away from the rule of law in Washington. He could actually take those to its natural conclusions, and I think he did. And we see that being dialed back once the federal government are able to provide oversight in Utah, and lots of those things that Brigham Young enacted were walked back to their kind of less extreme examples that maybe were Nauvoo. Still pretty bad in Nauvoo, right? These are the things that William Law and Wilson Law are complaining about in the Nauvoo Expositor, is just the violence that is being perpetrated in Nauvoo. So,
Right.
yeah, atonement, I think it absolutely has its beginnings with Joseph.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And then finally, I was going to ask you this question, but Salt and Pepper beat it to me. Ganesh, if there's anything left to be uncovered, what would you ask Joseph Smith if you could share a table with him, or would you even want to?
I have maybe this, and I hope it comes through in the book. I have a huge empathy for the plight that Joseph had as a young man, trying to figure out how he was going to turn up in the world and provide for particularly his own immediate family with Emma, but also, his extended family, because he felt incredibly responsible for his parents and his younger siblings. And I'd like to talk to that young man, I guess, which Joseph Smith would turn up. He feels incredibly emboldened and entitled by Nauvoo, and so I think that's why we see a lot of these things happening. And maybe that's a cautionary tale to the way that power corrupts, and gosh, I think that we can see plenty of parallels to today, which is why I think even Joseph Smith's story is incredibly enlightening for how we might view how people in power, need to be scrutinized and held accountable. So and even the LDS Church, right, that particularly the Brighamite branch that ends up in Utah, and the ways that they've enacted Joseph's vision really of life and how it plays out, those are terrible. There's lots to be uncovered. I mean, the historical record is just so peppered with things, and we just making connections. And Megan and I have talked about this a little bit on the other podcast that we did, was that Joseph really loved men. I mean, we talk about polygamy a lot because it just is horrific, but his intimacy with other men is really incredible, and underpins the ways that people supported him and that he engaged with them. He went on adventures with other men. He went on missions with other men. He went on treasure digs with other men. He formed schools where he would spend all day learning stuff with other men. He learned Hebrew with other men. He did transmasing with other men. Bromances. He was engaged in a ton of bromances, and part of my TikTok channel, I went through each one and tried to dissect, the bromances that Joseph Smith engaged in, and there were multitude, and people, lots of men ingratiated themselves with him, and he ingratiated himself with them. This was not like, certainly some of them were power dynamics, but there were some that seemed incredibly tender, which makes. And this is part of 19th century America. Men and women were often separated by their roles and things like that. Joseph Smith, I love that. But there was certainly some intimacy, real intimacy. Later, so I think, the two things that I think that would be really interesting to uncover would be to see if some of those intimacies you could pin whether they also went to some kind of sexual things. Was Joseph Smith bisexual? I don't know. It would be a really interesting thing to discover some things. There is a couple of things that suggest this. When in 1842, Joseph is having a huge bromance with John C. Bennett, and they are engaged in soliciting women on a casual sexual basis. I think in terms of concubinage, not marriage, right? I think that the scandal of 1842, where these women are saying, "Gosh, this is predatory." Part of the backlash against that means that Joseph has to split with his bosom buddy, John C. Bennett, and throw him under the bus to save himself. And I think that a couple of things that come up as part of that is that, one, I think these ideas of casual sexual relationships, which I think are emboldened in this idea of concubines, moves to some more legitimacy with regard to wives. So I think that some of those relationships, maybe even all of them, I don't know, it's really hard to tell, are the idea that you can be free sexually, free love. This is part of what being human is. And, you can engage in sex and for it to be mutually pleasurable. And so, there definitely became a predatory aspect of that. But perhaps it didn't start like that. Perhaps it was the idea of providing, good intimacy for women who were oftentimes not in charge of being able to have that. And then it moved with this, the rhetoric moved to wives rather than concubines to try and legitimize and account for and justify what was actually happening. And in this break with Joseph with the Smith sexual, whatever he wanted to do, gosh, that could well be the case, right? But with this break with John C. Bennett, John C. Bennett's accused of a lot of things. One is, these casual sexual relationships, but he's also accused of homosexuality. And Joseph just seems to brush over this without any, no condemnation whatsoever, which seems really interesting. Like if he, because by this time John C. Bennett is fighting against Joseph, and he could have, stuck the knife in, right, and said, homosexuality and John C. Bennett, and and did it, and he didn't. Which I don't know, and maybe this was the line that he didn't want to transverse because maybe he was engaged in some of that, and maybe John C. Bennett would have, retaliated with some information that we, I don't know. It's really hard to tell. But one of the things I think the church could adopt was the idea that Joseph never spoke against homosexuality, even though it did come up, particularly in 1842. So why are we even speaking against it today? There's nothing against homosexuality in the Book of Mormon. There's nothing in Joseph's life that suggests against it. And when he had a chance to speak against homosexuality, he did not, which is, so I don't know. There's really interesting dynamics here. Even people who engaged in homosexual acts might not have considered that to be homosexual. They were heterosexual people who engaged with sex with their wives, but maybe because of opportunity and accessibility, participated in homosexual acts with each other. There is one place where Joseph talks about lying with a brother because they're just so close, and that's also in that kind of same vein. But again, this is 19th century America. There's euphemism. There's not necessarily people talking about these kinds of things. So, gosh, I don't know, but it would be really interesting if the archives told us more about that. And that's something that we just are not yet able to bear milk before meat, with regard to Joseph's sexuality.
Yeah, and that's kind of, one of the things that the brethren will say is that, we're not ready to handle all of the truth yet. And so that's why they keep things locked up in the archives in Salt Lake. I don't necessarily buy that. So just a couple of housekeeping things. My e-course on identifying and defending against manipulation and control is 50% off until the end of the day. So there's the link for it. The code is PEACE50. And then I also had a request for membership link, and I'm going to put it in here as soon as I can get it copied here. And I do have to say, though, that sometimes on some devices, it's hard to see the membership tab. And so if you can't do it on your phone, you might have to do it on an actual computer. It's a Google thing. It's not anything I control, unfortunately. And then also, I want to make sure that I drop again the link for Ganesh's book here in the chat. It's also in the video description. Everybody should go and buy it. It's incredibly fascinating. I'm so excited to read the entire thing from cover to cover and then have another episode with all of my questions, because I'm sure I will have a lot of them.
And I see that there's a lot of questions in the chat. And when the YouTube's up, if you ask these again in the body, then I'll try and go through it over the next few days and answer as many of them as I can with as detail as I can. So
yeah. So I always say, if I miss your comment in the chat because I was paying attention to something else, please put it in a comment on the static video, and I'll do my best to answer it. So Ganesh is offering the same thing here. Jasmine Height Bradley had some incredibly awesome questions. Just didn't have time to cover them. We're already at 2 hours. So please definitely put those down in the comments, especially this one. I would love to address this one as well. I think that's an important thing. It's important to note too, that once Joseph was killed and Brigham Young took over, he continued that legacy of violence. And, that's kind of like next episode of violence in Mormonism. We need to talk about Brigham Young. So, but I bought a book at Sunstone that I want to read first, and then we'll dig into that. So there's just a lot to talk about. Yeah. So Ganesh, thank you so much for being here. You're so generous with your time. I appreciate you. I love you. I think you're wonderful. I really loved hanging out with you at Sunstone. And just, thanks for your generosity, your scholarship, your intelligence, your kindness, and your mischief.
Thank you. I so enjoyed our time together, and also today has been lovely. I love to talk about the implications, because I'm an active member of the church. I want this faith tradition, this tribe that I feel incredibly connected to be good and to account for its past in ways that will help heal its future. So that's my endeavor, and I hope to do it. And I'm glad for the opportunity to be able to engage in this particular forum, because I see you as one of those great pioneers, Megan, who is working to help heal people, particularly in their midlife, with the trauma that they might have experienced. And I think that that's an incredibly great gift to the world, and you are a treasure.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. Thanks for being here, everybody. Please take a second to like the video if you haven't already, and please share it with someone who would really enjoy it. And as always, please take good care of yourself. See you soon.